Fear and Hunger is a mix of JRPG and survival horror with dungeon crawler elements developed by just one person, excluding the artists. The game was released on December 11, 2018 and, judging by the reviews in stores, unfortunately, it did not gain much popularity. For all its visual simplicity, Fear and Hunger is probably the toughest and darkest game I've ever played. In Fear and Hunger, the element of horror is achieved not so much by audio-visual images, but by real danger to the hero we play as. Let's just say that in the very first minutes of the game, your hero runs the risk of being brutally raped by a mutant jock and, after that, finding himself with severed hands in a pit with corpses without the ability to get out. To survive, you will have to resort to not the most humane activities, and this, as a rule, is only encouraged by the game. The action of the game will take place in the castle of the same name, the Prison of Fear and Hunger. This is such a colony for especially distinguished ones, which was built over the ancient catacombs, so as not to bother too much with the design and digging of tunnels. After all, why not? What could go wrong? And absolutely everything does not go as planned, after which hell begins to happen. The catalyst for someone to need to get there was the fact that there is a very important person sitting there, who for various reasons is needed by each of the 4 heroes that we will play as. Actually, the plots for these characters are not particularly original, but what saves here is that the mission to save this person eventually acquires interesting details about what actually happened in the fortress with its twists and a certain non-linearity. And the more you find plot information, which, you also need search, the more you understand how complex events take place in the game. But in order to somehow enjoy the local story, you will have to sweat, because each little book with useful information will be expensive. As soon as you start the game, on the threshold of your dungeon, the first enemy of this game, the guard, is waiting for you. The guard will teach you the 3 basics of combat in this game. First and second, enemy attacks will not only take away health, they also hang dangerous debuffs, and the fact that the game has an anatomical attack system, you can attack the enemy in the arm, leg or aim at the head, which is much more difficult and the chance of hitting the head is much lower than other parts of the body. He will teach you this, cutting off your hand, and for the rest of the game you will not be able to use a 2-handed weapon or carry a shield in your hand. And if you didn't learn the lesson and on the next turn didn't cut off his hand with a cleaver in response, then with the second blow he will grab your second hand and you can consider this a game over. Since the character loses the ability to use weapons, he can only conjure at an early stage the magician, and then his spell is rather weak, and attacks, in addition to taking away limbs, also take away health. But the enemy does not. Some wounds can be healed, but the items that do this are very rare and, therefore, sooner or later you either have to come to terms with the inevitable death of the character, or resort to particularly radical methods, such as sawing off the infected arm yourself. But before that, you still need to guess and find how to cut this thing off. However, if a guard or another monster cuts off a character's hand, then the only way to get it back is to convince another character to make love. Yes, you read that right, it's all part of the gameplay. But back to the plot of the game. So, in 809, a new team of super friends appeared, the Brotherhood. 5 people decided that the world was rotten and it was impossible to live like that, from which, armed with whatever they could, they set off to look for the city of the gods in order to change the world for the better. At that time, the city was ruled by an evil sorcerer, defeating which 4 super friends became new gods and created a new religion in honor of themselves. A team of 4 possessed special souls, the soul of domination, the soul of enlightenment, the soul of the martyr, and the soul of infinity. However, they were all deceived, as special souls, divine powers and the city of the gods are all just a front to keep the world revolving around the idea of destruction and sex. 700 years after these events, a new puppet of the gods is born, Legate, the captain of the mercenary squad. A man from a prophecy that was dictated by the old gods decides to carry out an ambitious plan. Ascend like Jesus and bring renaissance to people, pulling them out of the miserable Middle Ages. The cunning plan to save humanity is simple and banal. You need to combine 4 divine souls into one and become a god among the gods, get the soul of domination through conquests, soul of enlightenment through the extraction of an ancient artifact, the soul of anguish after being tortured in the dungeon of fear and hunger, which was built on top of this very city. He received the soul of infinity through a connection with one of the 4 new gods, the goddess Nilvan, who possessed this soul. However, Nilvan had her own plan, and she simply abandoned Leged, having received from him the seed of the Chosen One. What's with the characters? Well, how many special souls, so many characters, mercenary Kahara with an infinite soul, who climbed into the dungeon by order of officials. However, the main goal of our possible protagonist is wealth. There are a lot of artifacts left in the city of the gods that can be profitably sold. The main thing is to get out of the dungeon in one piece. Nightdar. The soul of domination went to her. However, she simply weaves intrigues in order to get gods chosen purely for herself. Dark Priest Enki. Following Leged for the same reason, just to admire the guy from the prophecy. Barbarian Ragnvald. A proud Viking with the soul of a martyr, the only one who goes into the dungeon to destroy Leged, and not partake of the prophecy. So, 4 prepared characters that can be slightly tweaked in the backstory to change their main abilities and equipment. And yes, it's also a major gameplay element, and affects how your journey into a given dungeon goes. Since the dungeon is easy to remember, even with a little redecoration after the creation of a new character, the Evil Finish developer decided to introduce a non-dynamic loot system. Namely, in chests and in any things where useful loot could potentially lie, you will have to toss an in-game coin. Eagle and you get loot. Do you want to save? Please come to the bed and flip a coin, Eagle, and you will be safe and sleep. Tails and Mini-Boss will come to tell you good night, resting you forever. Maybe it's time to finish. No, don't think about it, there are many more interesting things that can be told about the dungeon. You can talk about the cheerful inhabitants of the dungeon, mutants and psychopaths of all stripes. Here you have priests of various cults who, in exchange for sex, will restore health or a strip of hunger. And a local dog that you can befriend if you offer her rotten meat. And finally, a furry pedophile, a follower of the crazy moon, who has extremely useful things with him, but is ready to exchange them only for children. We'll talk more about him when we analyze the second part. But it is better that you know all this yourself. Yes, my friend, so there were no spoilers on the plot and what will await you. All the most important for the plot, you will see for yourself as the game progresses. The world of fear and hunger, despite a bunch of borrowings and rough edges, is extremely interesting with its geography and mythology, and the gameplay, despite the limitation of the engine, gives the surprisingly many mechanics and ways to solve problems that stand in the way of the player. The only thing that remains for this to enter is the Dungeon of Fear and Hunger, where there is a lot of violence, in both senses of the word, cruelty and atrocities. But it's not all useless. Hardcore mode unlocks happy endings for characters, showing that even in the darkest darkness in the world of violence and sex, there is always a harder path that will lead you to a well-deserved happy end.